Life processes in bacteria. Yes, like all living things, bacteria carry out their several life processes. But for our lesson today, our focus will be on the nutrition and also on reproduction. So, like I've said, the organism is able to undergo all the life processes. So, talking about something like movement. In our previous lesson, I showed the structure of bacterium where we saw flagella. So, it uses flagella for movement. And when you talk about another life process like excretion, it does so by simple diffusion. So bacteria actually undergo the life processes. But for our lesson today, our focus would be on nutrition in bacteria and how bacteria reproduce. So we are starting by looking at nutrition. And because bacteria are a group of organisms, there are so many forms of them, and different forms or different bacteria exhibit their nutrition differently. So their nutrition can be categorized into the two main modes of nutrition, autotrophic and heterotrophic. So in autotrophic nutrition, it means the organism is able to make its own food. And the food we are talking about here would be the carbohydrates. So specifically we talk about glucose. Right, so we have organisms that are able to make their own glucose, and here specifically bacteria. There are some bacteria that make their own glucose, and there are other bacteria that would depend on some other organisms for their food. So we are going to pick them one after the other. So for the autotrophic, we will talk about those that are photosynthetic, meaning they use light to make their own food, and we will talk about the chemosynthetic. They use energy from chemical reactions to make their own food. Right. Then we come and talk about saprotrophic mode of nutrition. That will be under heterotrophic mode of nutrition. And we also talk about parasitic mode of nutrition. So down here, these four modes of nutrition are what we are going to deal with. Okay, so let's start. We are starting with the autotrophic. And here we have said that these organisms are able to make their own food, specifically these bacteria. So we have those that are photosynthetic and they make their own food using light energy. Example is cyanobacteria, and what we refer to as blue-green algae. And then we have the chemosynthetic forms that also make their own food, just that their source of energy for making the food is not light, as in the case of the photosynthetic. Theirs, they get their energy from chemical reactions. So an example is the nitrifying bacteria. Then we can talk about the heterotrophic forms, which are the bacteria that depend on other organisms for food. And here, I've already said that we have the saprotrophic forms, or the saprotrophic bacteria, which can also be referred to as saprotrophs. They decompose organic matter and absorb nutrients from them, and this is how the bacteria do it. And let me even say that they are the ones that cause decay to organic matter. So what they do is that when there is a dead animal somewhere, for example, some bacteria, and not only bacteria, there are some other organisms as well, but because we are dealing with bacteria in this case, some bacteria would settle on the dead animal and then would release enzymes onto the animal. The enzymes will break down the cells of the animal and make nutrients available. So the nutrients that have been made available would be absorbed into the cells of bacteria. That is their mode of nutrition, a very simple one for that matter. And if you leave your food unpreserved, they would settle on the food, do same. They would cause this kind of extracellular digestion, release enzymes onto the food. The enzymes will break down your food, and as they do that, your food gets spoiled. That is saprotrophic mode of nutrition. Right. Okay. So we can also talk about parasitic bacteria. They are the ones that infect cells of other organisms. So these bacteria would enter cells of another organism and then feed directly from the cells of the organism. And they are the ones that of course cause diseases. So as some of the diseases have been listed here, cholera is caused by them, pneumonia, tuberculosis, typhoid, syphilis, and gonorrhea. To them they are feeding, but to you they are causing you harm. But that is association in biology. Yes, it's life. Okay. So these are the modes of nutrition I would like us to look at in today's lesson under bacteria. Now we are moving on to reproduction in bacteria. For their reproduction, bacteria actually reproduce mainly by binary fission, which is an asexual means of reproduction. An asexual means of reproduction means that it doesn't require cells from different individuals. So only one bacterium can divide itself into two. Those two can also further divide themselves into two. Then it continues that way. So if you're talking about binary fission, we can summarize it in two main stages. We can talk about the genetic material dividing into two, or the DNA dividing into two, and the remaining part of the cell also dividing into two. That is in summary how we would put it. But in this, we are going to describe it in four main stages. So the first stage we are going to talk about is when the cell elongates. So the cell would increase in length, or would be longer than its actual length. And after that, the DNA replicates. DNA replication means the DNA making a copy of itself. So here we see the DNA molecule which has replicated. So there are two of them. So it has made copy of itself. So there are two of them. And when this is done, the cell now begins to divide. So you can see it here, there, as the cell has begun dividing. Then a crossword would be formed completely between the two DNA copies. So you can see this is what I mean. The crossword has been formed so that would lead to the separation of the two cells. And finally the cells separate to become two new individuals. Okay. So that is for asexual reproduction in bacteria, and that is their main means of reproducing. And note that under normal conditions, binary fission can occur within every 30 minutes. Even some put it as happening within every 20 minutes. Yes, so you can see how fast bacteria can reproduce within a short space of time. Now let's look at other means of reproduction that resemble sexual reproduction, which has been observed in bacteria. One of them is transformation. And for transformation, we mean that there is transfer of parts of DNA from one bacterium to another, normally picked from the environment. That is transformation. So if there is any portion of DNA that is from one bacterium but is found in the environment, another bacterium can just pick it up and it would be integrated into its DNA. And let us know that when you're talking about sexual reproduction, you mean it involves two different individuals. So in that sense, this one is not really a complete means of sexual reproduction. That is why I put it as resemble sexual reproduction. Right? Because this is just a part of the DNA that has been transferred to another bacterium. Then there is another called transduction, which follows very closely the way transformation goes. But this time, a vector is involved. So this is also transfer of DNA from one bacterium to another bacterium. But this one is not picked from the environment as in the case of transformation. This one is carried by a virus called bacteriophage. We have talked about bacteriophage already. So if bacteriophage infects one bacterium and picks up parts of the DNA of that bacterium, and the bacteriophage infects another bacterium, the DNA of the earlier bacterium can be transferred into the new one. So that is what we refer to as transduction. And then there is conjugation, that involves transfer of genetic material between two cells that are in direct contact. So one cell, another cell, DNA from one cell is transferred into the other cell. Right, so that is conjugation. So these are what we have for reproduction in bacteria. Right, and that also ends our lesson for today. So far we have looked at the modes of nutrition in bacteria, where we talked about the two main modes of nutrition, autotrophic and heterotrophic. And an autotrophic mode of nutrition, we talked about photosynthetic and chemosynthetic. And under heterotrophic, we talked about saprotrophic mode of nutrition and parasitic mode of nutrition. Then we came to talk about how bacteria reproduce, starting with the asexual means by binary fission. Then we talked about some forms that resemble sexual reproduction. Okay, so let's try these questions before we end our lesson for today. You are to list 2 examples of each of the following modes of nutrition in bacteria. A is heterotrophic mode of nutrition. B, autotrophic mode of nutrition. Then the last question, describe briefly the stages involved in binary fission in bacteria. Okay. Next, we are going to look at economic importance of bacteria. So don't forget to join as we continue to learn about bacteria. Okay. So see you in the next lesson.